All right, let's dive right in. We're going to go back to the very beginning of the United States to unpack one of the most important arguments in American history. This was a battle over the very blueprint for the new nation.
So just picture it. You've just pulled off an impossible win against the biggest superpower on the planet. Awesome, right? But now what? The new country is fragile, it's disorganized, and it's completely broke. The question wasn't just, what's next? It was more like, are we even going to make it? A brand new constitution was the proposed answer, but wow, it almost ripped the founding generation in two.
This wasn't just some polite political disagreement. This was a full-blown battle for what America was going to be. A really high-stakes fight that would set the course for the nation's entire future. See, their first crack at a government, the Articles of Confederation, well, it just wasn't cutting it. The national government was way too weak to deal with the country's massive problems. America's leaders knew they needed something stronger. A government that could, actually govern.
So the solution? A new constitution, drafted completely in secret. It was a pretty radical idea for a much stronger national government. But the second it was revealed to the public, it triggered this huge backlash, splitting the founders into two totally opposing teams.
So who were these two sides anyway? Let's meet the players in this great debate. You had the Federalists on one side and the Anti-Federalists on the other. And they had very different ideas about power, government, and what liberty really meant.
And there was a real difference in who was on each team. The Federalists, they were often the nation's elite. Think wealthier, more educated folks, people living in the cities. But the Anti-Federalists, their support came from small farmers, people in rural communities. Basically, you're looking at two different Americas with two very different sets of worries.
The Federalists had some serious star power. I mean, we're talking George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, literally the two most famous Americans alive. Plus, these brilliant political minds like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they were a force to be reckoned with for sure.
But don't you dare underestimate the opposition. The Anti-Federalists had their own heavyweights. We're talking revolutionary heroes like Patrick "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" Henry and Samuel Adams. They also had incredibly sharp writers and thinkers like George Mason and Mercy Otis Warren, who just powerfully laid out the case against this new constitution.
So what was the actual core of their argument? What were they really fighting about? Well, it all boiled down to a huge clash over power. Who should have it? How much should they get? And how do you stop that power from destroying the very liberty they had all just fought a war to win? And for every single problem, they had completely opposite points of view. The Federalists wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, they were terrified it would just become a new kind of tyranny. Federalists said the national government had to be supreme to get anything done. Anti-Federalists were worried the states would just get gobbled up. And this is a big one. The Anti-Federalists pointed to this massive hole in the plan. There was no Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms.
At the absolute heart of all this was this idea of federalism. It's really just the question of how you split power between a big national government and the individual states. The Federalists wanted to tip the scales toward the national government, while the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep as much power as possible with the states, closer to the people.
Hearing them argue in their own words really brings this whole thing to life. So let's take a look at some of the most powerful arguments, straight from them.
This quote from the Anti-Federalist writer who called himself Brutus just nails one of their biggest fears. See, the thinking at the time, based on all of history, was that a republic could only really work in a small country. Brutus was arguing that a nation as huge as America was basically destined to fail, because some government far, far away couldn't possibly represent everybody's interests.
And then, James Madison comes in with this absolutely brilliant counter-argument in Federalist number 10. He completely flips the old wisdom on its head. He argues that America's huge size was actually its greatest strength. With so many different groups and interests all competing, no single one could ever get powerful enough to crush everyone else. It was a totally radical and, frankly, genius idea.
But maybe the most effective, most powerful argument the Anti-Federalists had came from George Mason. He pointed out the obvious. The new Constitution didn't have a Bill of Rights. He said, look, if the national laws are supreme, what good are the little bills of rights in our state constitutions? And that argument hit home for people who had just fought a revolution over their rights being violated.
Now, the Federalist reply wasn't a list of rights, it was a system. Madison explained that the Constitution was basically designed like a machine that uses human ambition to check itself. By separating powers and giving each branch ways to block the others, the government would control itself.
It was a structure designed to protect liberty, not just listed on a piece of paper. So, who won? And what does this 230-year-old fight even mean for us today? Let's unpack the outcome and the incredible legacy of this whole debate.
Ultimately, the Federalists had a key strategic advantage. They had a concrete plan. The Constitution was it. The Anti-Federalists were brilliant at pointing out all the potential problems, but they never really got together and offered one single alternative plan. And that turned out to be a really decisive factor.
But the outcome is so fascinating because in a way, both sides won something huge. The Federalists, they got their Constitution ratified, creating that stronger national government they wanted. But the Anti-Federalists, they achieved this massive triumph. Their relentless demands and criticism directly forced the addition of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments.
So just think about that. While they technically lost the vote on the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists' legacy is absolutely monumental. The freedoms we think of as being central to America, freedom of speech, religion, the press, they all exist because the so-called losers of this debate absolutely refused to back down.
And that brings us to the final, really crucial point here. That core question of federalism, that balancing act of power between the national government and the states, it was never really settled for good. It's the exact same fundamental tension we see playing out in political debates today. The arguments of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists aren't just history. They are alive and well, shaping the world we live in right now.